Where's the evidence? That's what Senator David Leyonhjelm asked back on March 2nd in a Senate Estimates Committee hearing about the alleged clear link between violence towards women and attitudes of disrespect and gender inequality. And what was the answer from the Department of Social Services managers Tracy Bell and Dr. Rosalind Baxter? Well, listen to it for yourself.
The TNS document states, and I'm going to quote here, there is strong community support for the cessation of extreme violence against women. The significant barrier to achieving this change, however, is low recognition of the heart of the issue and where it begins. This is a clear link between violence towards women and attitudes of disrespect and gender inequality. But there is no citation provided for this clear link, despite the depth of literature on violence and its causes. Can you give a citation for the claim that disrespect and gender inequality is where extreme violence against women begins and is at the heart of the issue?
Senator, I would have to take that on notice.
Okay.
I may be able to get that tonight. I can check, but otherwise I'll have to take that on notice.
On notice is fine, yeah.
So she didn't know. Quite staggering when you consider that is the central thesis of the Let's Stop It at the Start campaign aimed at stopping violence against women. You'd think that's something she might know. Oh, and if you're wondering whether she got back to Senator Leyonhjelm as she said she would try to do later that night, no, she didn't. I called the Liberal Democrats media liaison today and asked him that very question. And as of today, April 12th, there had been no reply. So almost 6 weeks later, and they still can't present a shred of evidence for their central claim for this campaign. Now, to be fair, the deadline for a response is April 21st, so I guess we'll give them the benefit of the doubt for now, although I was informed that deadlines were often not met. But rest assured, I'll be checking back with Senator Leyonhjelm's office after that date, and also look out for an article from Miranda Devine, the source from which I was made aware of this story. She's almost a lone voice on these issues in the mainstream media. Now Leyonhjelm goes on to ask a follow-up question, which, surprise, surprise, is also taken on notice.
But while you're at it, can you also give a citation that suggests that poverty, alcoholic abuse and drug abuse are not where extreme violence against women begins and are not at the heart of the issue? I know that's attempting to prove a negative, perhaps, but I'm assuming that you've looked at this fairly thoroughly and there is some evidence that would suggest that disrespect and gender inequality is at the very least substantially more significant than poverty, alcohol abuse or drug abuse, and that's referenced.
I can take those on notice.
Mm-hmm.
And now Leyonhjelm's going to bring up a point which I've been raising for quite some time now.
Now, the TNS document states that the ABS Personal Safety Survey of 2012 is the most comprehensive Australian data source on prevalence of violence. Do you agree with that?
Currently in Australia, yes.
Mm-hmm. That TNS document cites the ABS Personal Safety Survey of 2012, which indicates that 8.7% of men reported experiencing violence in the previous 12 months, compared with 5.3% of women. Is this correct?
I'm not aware of that specific statistic, and that...
So Ms Tracy Bell agrees that this is the most comprehensive Australian data source on the prevalence of violence, but she's not aware of that statistic. Now, I don't blame her for not knowing all the numbers in that report. There is a lot of them, but it is the headline number in Table 1 of that report. It includes all violence, including threats of violence. And perhaps that's why she doesn't know it, because it shows quite clearly that men are more likely to be victims of violent crime, and that doesn't fit the narrative. But don't worry, Dr. Baxter is about to come to the rescue with a little sleight of hand.
Senator, we have some up-to-date statistics that we can
run you through in terms of the comparators, some of which are drawn from the PSS survey and some of which are drawn from the ABS victims and offenders data, if that would help. Mm-hmm. So in terms of comparison of both victim and perpetrator rates amongst men and women, the victims and offenders data of the ABS, which is drawn from police data, indicates that on average women were 2 to 5 times more likely to be the victims of family and domestic assault than men. So 64% of total female family and domestic violence assault victims were women, and 33% were men.
So you see what she did there. She went straight into talking about domestic and family violence. Lionhelm's questions of the ABS data referenced all violence. Now, I don't know if she did that deliberately, but the question should be asked. Why the focus on domestic violence? I mean, the campaign is about stopping violence against women, yet women are less likely to be victims of violence. Where is the Stop the Violence Against Men campaign? Or better still, how about a campaign against violence in general? Leave gender out of it. Now, an obvious response might be that men are also the majority of perpetrators of all violence, which of course is true. But does that mean male victims are not considered worthy because they share the same sex as their perpetrator? By that logic, if a mother beats her son and daughter equally, is the daughter less of a victim than the son? Or is it that the government is only concerned with victims of violence if they are women? Anyway, this conversation goes on for about 15 minutes, and I'm just going to pick out a few other interesting exchanges. But if you want to see the full exchange, I'll leave a link down below, and also a link to a copy of the transcript. Now, Lionhelm is going to ask a question which I think gets to the heart of the hysteria around domestic violence.
So the ABS Safety Survey of 2012 indicates that 1.5% of women reported experiencing violence, that is physical or sexual violence or threat by a partner or ex-partner in the previous 12 months, 1.5%. Would you class this as epidemic levels?
That wouldn't be for me to classify, Senator.
It's not for you to classify, but that is essentially the government's position. Why are hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on it if it's not an epidemic?
We do know that there is certainly a body of literature that suggests people are less likely to self-report violence if it has occurred very recently, and that may be because they're still with the partner who has been violent towards them, and so they might be less inclined to admit to themselves or others that they're in a violent situation, whereas with the passage of time, particularly if they've moved out of that relationship, people feel more comfortable and more inclined to admit that there was violence happening. So, again, it's a bit sort of swings and roundabouts.
That's a valid comment. Although you would expect that same influence on the numbers would apply, if the same methodology was used at different time periods. So the corresponding period for the 2005 survey, so 7 years prior, was also 1.5%, no change. Now, so 1.5% in 2012, 1.5% in 2005.
But still asking about experiences in the last year.
Yes.
So you're not asking necessarily the same women 7 years later?
Yeah, that's right.
No, that's not right, David. You had it right the first time. If the methodology is the same, it doesn't matter if it's the same or different women being asked. What matters is if it's a representative sample. And if the samples are representative, that is a fair comparison to make. The TNS report, which costs $420,000 of taxpayer money, does the same thing when it compares overall violence rates in the last 12 months and notes that the proportion of men experiencing violence in the last 12 months has reduced significantly over time.
But I guess the question is, would it be fair to say that there's a public view that domestic violence against women is on the rise, notwithstanding those same numbers?
I think there is certainly a public view that domestic violence is on the rise. Whether domestic violence is on the rise or whether community awareness about it is on the rise is an open question.
So there's actually no evidence that domestic violence is increasing. But then why all the fuss? Did we just wake up and discover that this is a national emergency? Or is it that certain interest groups want you to think that it is, even when the statistics say that it isn't?
In 2012, according to my data, 0.6% of men experienced violence by a partner or ex-partner during the previous 12 months. And given that more than a third of the reported victims of violence by a partner are men, Now, your number says less than that, 20-something, 28%, I think, but around about the right. You think a campaign concentrating on male perpetrators and female victims is disproportionate, leaves a significant part of the problem unaddressed?
So that, Senator, is probably a question that falls a little bit between Ms Bell and I. I think the important thing to note about the Stop It at the Start campaign is it's not a campaign about prevalence. It's a campaign that looked at the attitudes supporting violence against women, and in fact the developmental research went directly to that issue of, is there a particular attitude or community view that people have about violence against women? And the developmental research pointed strongly to the idea that violence against women and girls is excused and minimised. So that was the particular focus of the campaign, and you might like to add some more.
So if you didn't catch that, the rude femterrupter up in the top left-hand corner claimed that Senator Leonhelm was minimising violence against women. But in response to the question of why the focus is only on female victims and male perpetrators, Dr. Baxter's answer was, well, that's what the research focused on. Yes, we know that. Stop dodging the obvious question. The question is, why is the research only concerned with attitudes towards violence against women? Well, I suspect I know why. Because, as I've documented on this channel time and time again, attitudes towards violence against men are actually worse, and admitting that would ruin the narrative. Both sexes think it's more acceptable for women to hit men, and the disparity is quite significant for a number of items. For example, 13% think he's justified in hitting her if she calls him useless or good for nothing, whilst 26% think it's justified when the roles are reversed. 38% think he's justified in hitting her if she hits him first, but 60% think she's justified when the roles are reversed. Now, unfortunately, the male and female responses are lumped together, but the authors note on page 78 that while the relative acceptability of hitting in these situations may be similar for males and females, the absolute levels reported are quite different, with female-to-male violence being considered more appropriate or justifiable than male-to-female for each situation measured. A significantly larger proportion of respondents considered that a violent response by a woman either to be her right or to constitute a good reason to do so for all but the first three items. This apparent disparity in what is deemed to be appropriate behaviour by gender is noted across all subgroup analysis. Males and females are more likely to say a woman is right to or has good reason to respond to a situation by hitting than a man in the same situation. But I'll leave the last word to Senator Leonhelm.
These numbers I've cited you would suggest that the problem of domestic violence against men is rising, and it's not rising in relation to women, albeit I'm not disputing the fact that it is still twice the level that it is against men. But if we are talking about a problem that is growing, then the growing problem is the domestic violence against men. There is a problem of domestic violence against women, but the data would suggest that it's not growing.
Okay, I'm afraid any further questions will be have to place on notice, Senator Leonhelm.
So I urge you to equip yourself with the data and the arguments to push back against this narrative whenever you hear it. Because when you scratch the surface, you find there's very little in the way of evidence to support it. See you next time.